I had a very successful career in entertainment and in the media.
Pues todos nuestros repuestos, de pronto que tenemos una crema extra, perfume extra, jabones, y así tener un baño súper ordenado y no
I was a show host, so in various TV shows. Radio host, I was a professional singer-songwriter, journalist for lifestyle segments, and an actress.
Hola, soy Domenica Brazzi. Esto y mucho más hoy en Decorando Contigo. Acompáñame.
So I was doing my dream.
Aceites perfumados.
I was feeling so accomplished with myself. But then you get the diagnosis. The chemos, the radiation, everything is so hard to your body. So when I found out that the clinical trial was a pill actually with very little side effects, that is something that I want to say that for me a clinical trial means hope. And many people don't think about that. This is something that can give you hope to continue living and to continue fighting.
My name is Stephanie Trong. I'll be moderating today. And my background is I was a journalist when I was diagnosed myself with a blood cancer with non-Hodgkin lymphoma, specifically diffuse large B-cell, and went through hundreds of hours of chemo and grateful to say I've been in remission. But out of that experience, really wanted something more of a human voice out there. And that's what the patient story does. We try to humanize cancer through stories and through discussions like this one. And tonight we are collaborating with an amazing organization, the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, which offers many different resources. Tonight we'll be spotlighting the Clinical Trial Support Center, which is an incredible service, truly, for those of you who might be looking for, is a clinical trial right for me or my loved one? So I'd like to shift over to Chrissy. You work on the LLS side for the Clinical Trial Support Center, and you were on the other side of the phone or the computer hand-holding for Domenica and her family. Can you share more about yourself as well?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Chrissy. I'm located in the Midwest. I've been a nurse for a little over 10 years, and I have sort of worked in a few different spaces in the blood cancer world, most recently in CAR T-cell therapy and in clinical trial coordination. I've been with LLS for about a year and a half, but all of my background, from bedside to my job now, really gives me really a good understanding of the unique challenges and vulnerability that patients are in from the time they're diagnosed all throughout their journey.
You've seen it all, I'm sure, and working with the most vulnerable of patients. And so thank you, Chrissy, for sharing that. And your colleague, Leah leads the Clinical Trial Support Center for the LLS.
I have been a nurse for just about 20 years now. For the first 15 years of my nursing career, I was at the same Boston teaching hospital where I spent half the time in the medical ICU taking care of hem-onc patients, particularly bone marrow transplant patients. And then the second half of my time there, I was a nurse educator and clinical nurse specialist in cardiology and vascular surgery. So very different world. I came to LLS just about 5 years ago in the Clinical Trial Support Center, and this team has grown so much in such a short amount of time, but I feel really privileged to be part of this team. We're a team of 11 nurse navigators with incredible nursing expertise in hematology and oncology, and we work directly with patients, their families, and healthcare providers to help identify potential clinical trials and then overcome the barriers to enrollment.
Domenica, I would love to have you back on camera to share about how clinical trials started in your experience as a patient. Who was the person who brought up clinical trials for you?
Okay, yeah, in my case, my doctor is the one. I didn't, of course, I knew about clinical trials, but I didn't thought that I was going to be a candidate or that I was going to participate in a clinical trial. So when I moved from Mount Sinai Medical Center, and the doctor told me, listen, you have to go to Sylvester. I'm going to introduce you to a doctor because that they have lots of clinical trials. They have another kind of treatments that we don't have. And I appreciate that so much from him. And when I got to Sylvester, actually, the doctor is the one that talked to me about clinical trials. And basically, this specific that was going to be very good for what I was going through. That it was not only CLLs, but at that time, it transformed into a diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and Richter transformation. That is, as you know, is very aggressive and very difficult. So I thought that it was a great opportunity to be able to participate in something that is so new and something that can bring you like hope to continue the fight.
So Dominica, I know for you, this was a great opportunity, but also there were some pretty big questions you had up front about the clinical trial. It was your first time hearing about it, right?
Absolutely. Because the first time you say, okay, so what is going on? What is going to happen? What are you going to feel? And first of all, are you going to get a placebo? Because that's a typical thing that everyone says. Oh, no, you go to a clinical trial and you're going to get a placebo. You're going to be a guinea pig, et cetera, you know, all the comments of your friends and family or whatever. And what I learned when I brought that question to my doctor, he told me, in cancer, there are no placebos. So I felt much more comfortable because usually, you know, if it's another kind of illness, another kind of situation, they do placebos, but in cancer, no. So I felt much more comfortable going ahead and signing for the clinical trial.
Dominica, thank you for sharing that, because I think that's a very common list of concerns, right? You hear clinical trial, it sounds clinical, it sounds like science. I imagine that's a question that you get quite often there with the LSCTSC, the Clinical Trial Support Center, is there a placebo? And this phrase of guinea pig might pop up as well. So, you know, what are those top concerns?
Absolutely. So, when we're working with patients or family members, there are many different concerns like Dominica had, and there are many myths and misconceptions about clinical trials. So a big part of what we do is help to educate and really clarify what clinical trials are. So as Dominica said, it's really important to emphasize that first and foremost, safety is the number one priority in any clinical trial. For a cancer clinical trial, a patient will never only receive a placebo. It would be completely unethical for a patient to receive only a placebo when there is other active therapy that could be given. So what happens is sometimes in later phase clinical trials, and we'll talk more about that, there may be a placebo used, but it will always be in combination with whatever is considered the best approved therapy. Another misconception is that when clinical trials are talked about, patients sometimes assume that must mean there is no hope for them. And so something else I really want to emphasize tonight is that there are clinical trials for every stage of illness, whether it's for patients who are newly diagnosed and have not yet received treatment, if it's for patients whose disease has not responded or come back after treatment, but there are also clinical trials for people who are in maintenance therapy, into remission, and well into survivorship. So what we really work to do is to destigmatize the word clinical trials, because I think another really important thing to share is that 20% of cancer clinical trials in our country close not because the treatment didn't work, but because they never get enough people to enroll. And so we really need to really dispel these myths, these concerns, and increase awareness about what clinical trials really are. Cancer clinical trial participation is really the key step in advancing treatment. And it's really how we're going to help bring treatments that work for people to the rest of the population. And we really want the people who are participating in the trial to be representative of our diverse population. So there's lots of really important aspects of increasing awareness.
Thank you, Leah. Dominica, I want to go back to you now, because I know that for you, when you heard about a clinical trial, you did have the thought of placebo and guinea pig, but then you said, this is bringing me hope, which I thought was very powerful. How did your doctor describe the clinical trial to you in that first conversation?
Yeah, well, Stephanie, when I spoke to the doctor explained to me everything about the clinical trial. How does it work? All the things that you have to do, the different tests, the different phases, and of course, how you can be accepted or not. Because depending on the test, you are in the protocol of this clinical trial or not. So it was very interesting to know everything about it because, as I said, I never went into a clinical trial and I never knew. So besides that, regarding the phases also, I think it's very important, for me, it was very important to know that in my case, that first clinical trial and also the second one that I spoke to you before, they were in phase 2. So I felt much more comfortable in a phase 2 trial than in a phase 1. And that also, my doctor explained everything. And of course, all the paperwork and everything that you have to go through. One very important thing is that I always ask, what phase was that? Because I didn't want to be in phase 1. I know that there are 4 phases. So the phase 2, I felt much more comfortable. And luckily, this clinical trial was going to start in phase 2.
Wonderful. Dominica, thank you so much. Okay, so Leah, Dominica, I think, expresses something that a lot of people have concerns about, which is we know there are different phases. We might not know much about what these different phases are in the approval process for a clinical trial to go from research to hitting the market. What is this process?
Sure. So it's a rigorous process, Stephanie. And what's important to understand is that any therapy that's approved today, whether it's a chemotherapy or a different cancer therapy, or even something over the counter that you can go pick up at CVS or Walgreens, at one point was in a clinical trial. And so before a clinical trial even starts, the research begins in the lab setting. And so researchers take either a new treatment, or maybe it's a combination of drugs that have never been put together before, and they test it in either petri dishes or animals to really see if that is safe and promising in that setting. And if it is, it can go through the very arduous process of becoming a formal clinical trial. And so the first phase of clinical trial, a phase 1, is considered first in human. It's a very small number of patients, usually around 30. And the goal of a phase 1 clinical trial is to determine what is the optimal dose. So the highest dose with the least amount of side effects. And so within that small group of patients, researchers give a group of patients a certain dose. And then if that is well tolerated, give a different group of patients a higher dose and keep doing that until they determine what that optimal dose is. After they've determined that, it can move into a phase 2 clinical trial. And this phase has slightly more patients, somewhere around 100 or so. And at this point, researchers say, okay, we have this new treatment that is safe, but does it actually work the way we had hoped? And so every clinical trial is set up differently in terms of what outcome measures it's striving to meet. The focus of that phase 2 trial is to see if they can achieve those outcomes. And so again, this phase can take another year or 2 as well. Now, there are many more phase 1 and phase 2 trials than there are phase 3, which I'll talk about. And the reasons for that are A, they never have enough patients accrue, as I mentioned before, and they have to close, or they may never meet those measurements or those goals at each phase. But at the end of a phase 2, if the research team has a treatment that is safe and effective, it can move into a phase 3. And this is where there are 2 groups of patients. One group gets whatever is being studied, this new treatment, and the other group of patients is getting whatever is considered the gold standard or approved therapy. And what researchers want to know is our new treatment as good, if not better, than what is considered the gold standard? And at that point, that's when a new treatment can go forward with FDA approval and be accessible to the rest of the public. Phase 4 trials are when something has gone through the prior steps and become FDA approved. There can be a more long-term analysis of side effects and effectiveness, and that would be considered a phase 4 trial.
So thank you, Leah. Dominica, you went to two medical centers. In the beginning, you're in the Florida, in the Miami area. And so in the beginning, you went to a great place, but maybe smaller. And so it was that doctor who acknowledged, right, that they didn't have the
Yes.
resources.
Exactly. Yeah, he told me, and I appreciate that so much and thank him so much, because he thought and he knew that he couldn't do anything else for me. We started with the R-CHOP, that is the typical treatment for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and unfortunately it didn't work after the third or fourth round of chemo, and that was it. So I moved to Sylvester Cancer Center, and there is where the doctor told me about the clinical trials. And it was a great discovery, to tell you the truth, because I didn't even think. At the beginning, I was going to do CAR-T, and supposedly that is why he sent me to Sylvester. But then when I go to Sylvester, the doctor in Sylvester is the one that said, no, let's wait for CAR-T and let's try this clinical trial. That was my first clinical trial. So, and he ran me through all the steps and things that you have to do and the tests and everything before being admitted in a clinical trial, because it's a long process, Stephanie, you know.
I think what's really interesting is that doctor said, hey, let's go to a bigger center where they might have more options. And so it is really important, right, to be able to work with a doctor who not only encourages you to find all the treatment options, but maybe even suggests that you go somewhere else. I'd love
Absolutely.
for you to talk about how actually it became a successful relationship, right? The different doctors working together.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, and also something that I didn't mention before, that I have, well, a second opinion. I think that is very important, because when you have this kind of cancer, and more if it's so rare, it's always good to have a second opinion to balance and see what's going on in different centers. So I have another doctor also in Sloan, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and he's great too. And luckily, all the treatments that we've been talking about and that we've been doing in Sylvester, they agree, and they always talk to each other, and they communicate, and they work as a team. And that, I think, is super important for the patient, because another thing that is very important is that your doctor agrees. And I cannot thank him enough, because to tell you the truth, at the beginning, when I was thinking about a second opinion, I said, oh my God, the doctor is going to be offended. I don't know if I can do this. But I said, well, listen, it's my life. So I spoke to him, Dr. Calderuccio. I love him too. And he told me, please go ahead. If I was in your side, I would do exactly the same. So I think the support, that kind of support of the doctors, is so important for the patient, that you feel comfortable, not only with your doctor, but in this case, also having a second opinion.
Wonderful. I'm so glad that you had that experience. And I would say that that's best case scenario, honestly, is to have a team that encourages that first step and then works really well with others. But that will model for other people out there that it can be done, especially if you're dealing with a more rare cancer or chronic cancer. I'd like to bring in Chrissy. If you are not in Dominica's situation, you aren't going to a medical team or a doctor who's going to suggest this for you. What are the resources out there to help guide you? We know, of course, the LLS.
Right. So right off the bat, I have to obviously mention LLS and the Clinical Trial Support Center. So our service is a one-to-one nurse-patient relationship. And so we're really there for the majority of my patients that I work with for many weeks, months, and some even years. I've been working with Dominica for over a year. And it's really unique to every patient and what their needs are. But the biggest thing that I always tell patients, sometimes I meet someone on the street who tells me, my loved one has this diagnosis, and sometimes it's the patients I'm speaking with, is you are your own advocate. And, it's your life, not your doctor's life, not your nurse's life. It's your life. And so you have to be the one that advocates for yourself.
I love the message of self-advocacy. As Dominica said, it's very real. And I felt it as a patient as well. Love my doctor, also don't want to offend her. Am I going to offend so-and-so if I say, hey, I think you're great, but also, can we work with someone else? What is the message to people out there, both patients and their care partners?
So I think I want to point out that that is something that I hear from a lot of patients. Oh, I don't know if I want to send this trial search to my doctor. I don't know if I want to share with them that I'm looking elsewhere, or I'm scared to ask my doctor for a second opinion at another center. And I want to sort of dispel. I've been working in cancer treatment for 10 years, and I have. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a physician who is offended by that, because today's patients are more informed than ever. And physicians appreciate that. Physicians are more than happy to, help their patients seek second opinions elsewhere. And I think if you are with a physician who isn't, I think that says something in and of itself, that maybe that relationship with that physician isn't right for you. If you're with a physician who doesn't want what's best for you, to get a second opinion somewhere else, I don't know that that's someone I would personally want on my team.
So thank you, Chrissy. Dominica, if you could talk about, you already talked about it a little bit. This is something that people ask about, which is the logistics, the paperwork. I remember when I first heard about clinical trials, I just kept envisioning some big stack of paper and signing everything. Can you share some of that experience?
Yes, it was overwhelming at the beginning, the paperwork, as you said, is like this. So, and to tell you the truth, I didn't read the whole thing. I kind of went through, but I didn't have other option. I wanted to get into this clinical trial. So I signed the papers, but of course, it's very important. After they gave you a copy, and I started reading, but not in the office of the doctor, because it was too many things to read.
So much for sharing that about the paperwork. And being honest, who reads the whole thing? It's so hard. I'm sure that, Chrissy, if we could bring you back in, that was probably a common question that you would get, is what is this? And how do I deal with this?
Yeah. So one thing that I always did when I was helping consent patients to clinical trials was I always gave them the paperwork beforehand, anytime it was possible. But in the majority of instances, we knew about a patient, potentially coming in for a consult for a clinical trial, or we were switching gears in treatment. And the day or two, leading up to their visit, I would send them a copy of the consent. And I always advise, read this over. Bring your highlighter, write down questions. A lot of this is going to feel like there's medical terminology and it's too much to understand. Highlight that, circle it, ask, come with your questions. That's so important if it's possible. So that's a tip I like to give people, when I'm working with patients who are going for a consult at a different site for a clinical trial, is ask the question, can I get a copy of this before I sign it? And look it over. And, like I said, be prepared with questions. The other thing that I so much stress to patients is, while that is a very daunting and intimidating form, you can change your mind about participating at any time. Whether you sign the document there, with your physician, and you walk out of the clinic and you say, oh, I changed my mind, I don't want to do all of that. You can change your mind at any point. Like I said, immediately after the visit, a week after the visit, 6 months, a year later, you can change your mind about participation in a clinical trial at any time. And then the third big thing I like to advise patients to do is take someone with you to that visit. If it's the visit to discuss the clinical trial, if it's the visit to consent for the clinical trial, bring someone with you, because you as the patient are going to be receiving so much information that you're almost always going to walk out of that visit like, oh, I forgot to ask this, and this that I wanted to ask. If you bring someone with you, they know those questions that you wanted to ask, and they're at the top of their mind, and they bring them up. They're also really good note takers. They might, hear something that you didn't hear. And when you're, in the car on the way home and you're like, she said this, and your loved one's often like, no, she said this. So it's really always important to have a second set of ears for those visits.
Dominica, you were starting to talk about the many, many tests and scans. And I think it's really important to chat about this, because not only, is there a process in getting a referral even to the right clinical trial, and then matching, getting through the paperwork, going through all these things that Chrissy just talked about. If you do, they still need to make sure that maybe you're fit or right for this trial. And so lots of tests and scans, right? Can you talk about that?
Yes, definitely. At one point, you think that it's overwhelming because there is so many tests involved. Of course, the typical blood test with all the specifics, and PET, CT scans, You go through a bone marrow biopsy. And I want to tell you something very interesting, because in the second clinical trial, the one that I was telling you the other day that worked wonders for 8 months, they did a bone marrow biopsy and they didn't find the Richter. And they called me and they said, well, if we don't find it, I don't think you can be in the clinical trial. I freaked out, of course. But then they did a biopsy in another area in the breast, that is where I had the Richter, and they found it. So they really work on finding all the things that they need to follow the protocol of the clinical trial. And that way you can join. And it's incredible, because then after that, you have to go every week. That's something that I think everyone has to know, that you have to go maybe the first and the second month every week to do the follow-ups, the blood tests, see how your body's reacting with this new medicine that you have. And after that, then it goes like once a month. So I think it's great, because you feel that they are looking after you and you know what is happening inside your body. It's very important.
That is another way of saying, they are closely monitoring you. So maybe you can think of it as a white glove service. They're really, they're really making sure that they're attentive to your labs and your numbers and everything. I mean, some people might say this is a lot. So just be aware that there is a lot that goes into the monitoring part. But the other way that you're bringing this into perspective, Dominica, is you have someone who's got your back the whole time, right?
Yes.
You've got a special line to someone at all times. This is not unique to Dominica. The fact that she had to go through so many tests and scans. And for a lot of the people out there, just so you know, you may have already gotten a ton in the diagnostic, whether it's newly diagnosed or you relapsed. There may have already been some tests done by your medical team, but with a clinical trial, they kind of start from scratch again, right, Chrissy?
Yeah, so a lot of times the sponsor of a clinical trial needs like fresh samples. Imaging needs to be done within, so many days. Oftentimes it's like 14 to 28 days. And so patients will tell me, oh, I just had a scan. It's like, well, but it was 38 days and they require it within 28. Another reason that they do this is so that every single patient who's on that clinical trial is worked up in the same exact way. So that you're kind of, as much as possible, comparing apples and apples and saying that, every patient, you've got, the same workup, the same treatment, the same management on the clinical trial. And the reason that they do all of this rigorous testing, the number one reason is to keep patients safe. They want to make sure that, everything is as streamlined and the same and as safe as possible for every single patient. Another reason that they do all of this testing, understandably, is that we want to do clinical trials so that we can get more drugs to more patients. And that requires rigorous testing to make sure everyone is, as equally fit and healthy to participate, so that the clinical trial goes through as quickly and smoothly as possible, so that they can submit for FDA approval and get that drug on the market, so that hundreds and thousands more patients can have access to it.
But I do want to just talk about side effects really quickly. So for you, what was the difference, Dominica, between RCHOP, which many have experienced, and the clinical trial?
Exactly. Well, a big difference, as I was telling you, because the chemos, the radiation, everything is so hard to your body. So when I found out that the clinical trial was a pill, actually, with very little side effects, and for myself particularly, I didn't have any side effects. So it was a relief, because definitely you don't want to feel bad. You don't want to lose. I lost my hair, I don't know how many times. It came back so many times. But with this as target therapy, now that they say the BTK inhibitor and so, it's a completely different way of approaching your illness. And I think it's a great way to join the future, because for me, this is the future, and it's the future of hope for all of us that have blood cancers and other cancers, definitely.
Dominica's situation is actually more of the exception than the rule. She ended up getting to go through a clinical trial that was led by her oncologist, a hematologist oncologist. And so she did not have to travel, and she was at, the usual sort of appointments, it felt like. For most people, that will not be the case.
oftentimes a clinical trial will take someone away from home frequently or for an extended period of time. Most clinical trials are happening in the large academic centers. So for folks who don't live in those areas, you're talking about a lot of logistics to figure out. And so, I tell people all the time, wanting to enroll in a clinical trial and actually enrolling is not a straight path. There are just so many bumps in the road, and these logistics and finances are two huge bumps in the road. So, when we talk about the finances related to clinical trials, there's really three buckets of cost. So the first bucket of cost is whatever is being studied. So either a new drug, a combination of drugs, a transplant, or a CAR T therapy. And so that new treatment being studied is typically covered, the cost of that is covered by whoever's sponsoring the trial. But then you have the second bucket of cost, which is all the other healthcare. And so all those other healthcare related costs, the scans, the bone marrow biopsies, labs, IV fluids or antibiotics when needed, that all needs to either be billed to insurance or paid for out of pocket, which can be a significant cost. The third bucket of cost are all of the other expenses related to participation, travel, airfare, car fare, gas, food, lodging for you and for a caregiver. That is all, the majority of that will be out-of-pocket expense. Now, I will tell you that one of the questions that we arm our patients with is to go back to the study team and ask if the sponsor or the site has any money to help support covering for food, lodging, travel, et cetera. But what we have found is that oftentimes it takes kind of like building a patchwork quilt of resources to get people to a point where they can participate in that clinical trial. So at LLS, we have some really incredible financial support programs for patients. We also look outside at other advocacy organizations to really try to build together a plan to make it possible. But a challenge is certainly when patients don't have health insurance. Many times a clinical trial, unfortunately, is not an option for the reasons that I mentioned. But if someone comes to our department interested in learning more, and through that process, there's a different type of treatment that is in their next best interest, whether it's pursuing standard of care confidently or getting a medication through off-label or compassionate use, that nurse navigator is there to help you overcome whatever barriers there are to that treatment. And so it's, as nurses, we can be very savvy. It's a little bit of detective work sometimes, trying to piece together a plan to help somebody get to that optimal treatment. But, this team is so able and ready to do that.
There's other advocacy organizations that you will help pair people up with. There's the sponsor of the trial, which is usually the drug company. It could be the hospital or the healthcare system that is, in charge of this. And maybe you can ask. Sometimes they do have, reserves, if you will, like a bucket for patients. And the goal here is to let people know, just ask. There's no harm in asking. That's why they're there. A lot of times, actually, they're underutilized. And so starting with self-advocacy and saying, I deserve this care. How do I get from A to Z? Yes. Really want to dive now into clinicaltrials.gov. Well, Dominic, I guess first, did you ever try?
Well, to tell the truth, I went into the site and it was crazy. There are thousands, I don't know how many clinical trials for different cancers and different things. So you get lost. And there's when Chrissy comes and saves you because it's amazing, but she knows everything. She knows all the clinical trials that are coming. And one thing that is very important that I also like to address is that you always have to be ahead of the game because you don't know if it's going to work. You don't know how long it's going to work. So you always want to be prepared. And to tell the truth, Chrissy is being like the guardian angel because she finds out, she goes, she does everything and makes the finding the new clinical trial much easier, definitely.
Well, I want to say I am very thankful and blessed and honored to work with Dominica and her husband. They are incredible to work with. And I do want to touch back, Stephanie, on your comments about clinicaltrials.gov to just kind of reassure patients that if you've ever been on that website and you felt down about yourself, having trouble, navigating it, understanding what they were saying. I just want to tell you that in my last job, I worked at a really large academic institution in a stem cell transplant clinic, and I helped physicians, some of the most brilliant physicians I've ever worked with, navigate that website at least weekly. So up until just a few years ago, our team was actually using clinicaltrials.gov to do our personalized searches for patients. And it was, very felt that was a tedious process that could definitely be streamlined and improved. And so LLS poured a lot of resources into creating a proprietary database that only our team has access to. And it's a website that sort of sits on top of clinicaltrials.gov and updates every 24 hours. So to put simply, if it's on clinicaltrials.gov, it's also in our database. So we're constantly having meetings with physicians who are managing clinical trials, pharmaceutical sponsors of clinical trials, the trial teams at sites, to learn about the logistics. Is it a drug that a patient gets every week, for 6 months? Or is it a treatment that a patient gets once, but they have to stay locally for 30 days? Is there lodging and travel assistance available? Is there any published data in this space? And has there been any changes to the study, that maybe isn't on clinicaltrials.gov? Like maybe they're not enrolling this type of lymphoma anymore, but they are, this type of lymphoma. So we are always constantly updating that site so that all of our team has access to that information so that we can better serve patients.
Dominica, you've been through a couple different clinical trials and you're headed for another one, right?
Yes, absolutely. December, I was lucky to find another clinical trial that the doctor introduced me to. And we're going to start the test and everything, maybe in a couple of weeks. And great, I'm going to go to another, supposedly, I hope, successful clinical trial. And that is something that I want to say, that for me, a clinical trial means hope. And many people don't think about that. They think just about the chemical part or the bothersome that is causing by traveling or to getting the tests or to follow-ups and everything. But if you think about that, this is something that can give you hope to continue living and to continue fighting, I definitely don't have any doubt. I'm in, and if there's another one, I will be in. Because in my case, this is the only hope that I have.